What I want to talk about this evening is really definitional. This is with the 20th landscape lecture in the modern series here over the last several years. And it's built upon the foundation of the resurgence of interest, the kind of renewal of interest, the recovery, the renaissance of landscape architecture over the last 10 or 15 years. I'll say something about that, but what I've organized is a talk that begins with some basic definition. So the first is a kind of starter course that begins with the definition of, well, what do we mean by landscape anyway? The second course, again, is an appetizer course that then looks at the definition of the origin of the field of landscape architecture as a new professional conceived in the 19th century. And then the main body of the talk is really focusing on the idea of the landscape architect working as an urbanist in the shape of the city with respect to its social and its environmental conditions. So all of this material is taken from my recent book, Landscape as Urbanism, Princeton University Press. And in that book, I talk about a range of subjects, but the basic claim is that for a whole variety of reasons that we can talk about over the last 15 years, the landscape architect has reasserted her historic claim to working as the urbanist of our age. In that regard, we try to do some basic definitional conditions around what we mean by landscape. And so for me, the origin itself is something to spend a little bit of time on. The art historian Christopher Wood at Yale, in his book on the German painter Albrecht Altdorfer, used this definition, arguing that, quote, landscape in the West was a symptom of modern loss, a cultural form that only emerged after humanity's primal relationship to nature had been disrupted by urbanism, commerce, and technology. And for my purposes, we could really stop with urbanism. We have to understand that landscape was not associated with the pastoral, was not associated with the agrarian. Landscape was invented in the middle of Europe, in a couple of places, in the middle of the Renaissance, at precisely the moment of highly evolved mercantile economies, both in the north of Europe and in the Italian peninsula. It emerges as a genre of painting associated with divisions of labor in painting, and among other ways, around the depiction of what we'll call the formerly urban. So more so than a genre of painting that begins with the depiction of the agrarian or the natural, landscape, Wood argues, and I argue as well, landscape emerges initially as a genre of painting what had been the city. And in this regard, the best way to tell that story is with the depiction of Rome. You'll of course recall that Rome had been the center of Western civilization for millennia. It had lost something like 95 to 99% of its population. It went from something like 1 million citizens, depending on how you count them, to something like 30,000 residents. By the 15th century, Buffalini's map shows the inhabited portions of Rome, where 30,000 residents were clustered along the banks of the Tiber. Richard Krautheimer, in his definitive book on the medieval period of Rome, describes the population living like a nut within a shell, the shell being the Aurelian wall circuit. The interior hinterland here, the formerly urban and then abandoned portions of Rome, came to be known as the disabitato. And for me, disabitato is a key concept, it's a key place name in which, as late as Noli's plan in the 17th century, Noli, even though Noli is describing the urbanization of Baroque Rome, describes the disabitato as an interior hinterland, which has a combination of vineyards, orchards, a kind of suburban villa landscape in which the curia, the papal curia and the monarchs were being built out, but in which one could still find sites of abandonment and some danger. In this regard, among the many landscape painters at the origin of the genre we might cite would be the work of Claude Lorraine. So Claude Lorraine is working in the 17th century. Although he's born in the Duchy of Lorraine, he immigrates and spends most of his career working in Rome, and he spends most of his time, you can see here in this self-portrait, working in plein air, working in nature, which was a bit of an innovative technique. He, of course, was accompanied by an armed guard because it was a sketchy, kind of lawless territory. And he's doing a range of things. He's making drawings from nature. He's composing capricci, these capriccio that are really depictions that ultimately inform his larger canvas paintings. His canvas paintings in the 17th century come to be acquired by the crown princes of Europe, by the notable families, by popes and bishops alike. But for our purposes this evening, it's really his studies from nature. This is a study of an oak tree in the Villa Madama that he made in the middle of the 17th century, which is an extraordinary piece of work. It's ink drawing with wash, and it gives you some sense of his sensibility, his appetite for looking at landscape material as found. This is a self-portrait of Claude Lorraine. It's a self-portrait that he associated with his Liber Veritatis, which is his book of truth. It's a kind of early copyright in which he made original sketches or drawings of every one of the paintings that he produced. And in this, you can see he's made his portrait, his self-portrait, in a very small, dark, convex mirror, which a century later, a technique that would come to be known as the Claude glass, so that by the time of the 18th century, artists would take this Claude glass with them. In this Gainsborough sketch, you can see somebody of the gentry class from England with the dark convex mirror. And if you were a tourist at this time, you were meant to take the tour, go to Rome, and to turn your back to the sights of Rome and to gaze into the mirror and have an effect that was closer in proximity to the effect of a Claude painting, right? So the idea of being a tourist emerges in response to the emergence of landscape painting. And over the course of 2 centuries, one goes from having landscape as a form of painting, genre of painting, 16th, 17th century, to emerging as a form of subjectivity, a kind of touristic activity that if you were lucky enough to go on the Grand Tour and go to Rome, you might experience, but equally you might experience in the Lake District in England or other places on the continent, and that by the 18th century has become established as a form of activity that one can arrange one's own estate. So this is the business card of one Humphrey Repton, landscape gardener, who's effecting improvements on an estate, a private estate in England, around the idea of reorganizing the landscape and constructing follies so as to enable this landscape to conjure or evoke the qualities of the Claudian painting. Right? So we have, over the course of 2 centuries, the emergence of landscape as a genre of painting and the theatrical arts associated with the 16th, ultimately the 17th century. We then have the emergence of a touristic activity, mostly dominated by Northern Europeans and Brits, in which going on the Grand Tour, consuming those experiences with the Claude glass and coming back and recording those in sketches, and then ultimately the development of landscape gardening as a kind of avocation or a craft or maybe even a profession, in which one could reorganize one's estate so as to affect the grandeur of Rome, right? And so in this regard, we have to understand landscape gardening in the British tradition, the Anglo tradition, and certainly the tradition that informed the development of landscape architecture in the United States, as fundamentally a genre of painting about depicting what had been the center of the urbanized world. Highly mercantilized urban economies in which the grandeur of Rome, or the fall or the loss of Rome, is depicted and played out in private estates over the course of a century or 2. That story is still with us. I don't know how many of you have follies on your lands, but we can talk about that. The second piece of this argument then is, well, what do we mean by landscape architecture? So you've seen in the course of 19 lectures at this podium over the course of several years, 19 of the world's leading landscape architects presenting their work as design professionals. And so I wanted to begin by building a kind of foundational understanding. Well, what do we mean by this? I'm using here a quote by a fellow called Jeffrey Jellicoe. Jeffrey Jellicoe was none less than the founding president of the International Federation of Landscape Architects, IFLA, right? So our international body, founded by a fellow who, upon stepping down in 1959, immediately began to say, well, surely the landscape architect is wrongly named. And so problems of nomenclature have been with us for a long time, and I don't want to be just strictly a grammarian here, but I do have a sense that what we call it matters in some way. What we can say very clearly is that the profession of landscape architecture was conceived and invented on the eastern seaboard of the United States, somewhere between Brookline and Brooklyn in the second half of the 19th century. Of course, there were practices that predated this. There were antecedent practices of landscape gardening. There were experiences both in Germany and in France of professional activities at the mix of engineering, architecture, planning, and gardening arts. But really, full stop, the definition of a new professional emerges in the United States in the second half of the 19th century. So what do we mean by this? We mean, on the one hand, a new professional title. A group of boosters working between Boston and New York decided that in this period of time, the existing professional categories that we had were insufficient for the social and the environmental challenges of our day. And so by that, what do we mean? We mean architect, gardener, artist, engineer. These existing, long-established durable Western professional identities were perceived to be inadequate in the rapid pace of urbanization associated with, and the ultimate social and environmental challenges as well associated with the industrial period. In that regard, the landscape architect was conceived as a new professional that was meant necessarily to be capable of dealing both with urban form and planning, as we would call it today, but equally with the social and environmental conditions of the city. And so in that context, I've been interested in my work in the last couple of years to ask some basic fundamental questions, such as, in that formulation of the new profession, what was the first project? What was the first work of a landscape architect in this new professional identity? Thoughts? Anybody have any ideas about that? The emerald necklace, thank you. Other ideas? Trained as an architect, I had somehow been led to believe that the first work of a landscape architect in this modern professional sense in the United States was the work of Central Park. I took that at face value. I somehow, as I began to read into this, discovered a very, very different story. Of course, Frederick Law Olmstead, among other things, we could say, was a notable social commentator and journalist. Although he was not much of a businessman, one could say, he failed at both farming and publishing in a professional sense. And finding himself in the early to mid 1850s running out of options, his printing and journalism and publishing work, but also his mining expeditions and his farming work not really producing enough income, he found himself on the verge of going into debt, and at the advice of a family friend, took the recommendation to accept a position, a kind of civil service job, working for the commissioners of the Central Park in New York, newly formed, to work as superintendent of the Central Park. In this role, his primary role was to be an administrative organizer, somebody who could organize things politically, but also managerially. He very quickly, Olmstead Sr. did, argued for the holding of a design competition. He very nimbly partnered with Calvert Vaux, one of the most notable landscape architects or architects on the eastern seaboard of his time, having been a landscape gardener, of course, with Downing. And Olmstead and Vaux won this design competition famously along a strictly party line vote, 5 good Republican reform votes in favor of the Republican Olmstedian scheme, 4 Democrat machine votes losing. I don't want in any way in my work to diminish the myth around Olmsted or his contribution, but I want to situate it historically in a way that seems real, because I think what was accomplished there has really been obscured, and we've misread it in certain ways over the last several years. In all of this work, in accepting the position to serve as superintendent, in partnering with Vaux, in lobbying for and winning the design competition, Olmsted never used the term landscape architect. He referred to himself as an architect. Much to the chagrin of Calvert Vaux, who was in fact indeed an architect, but in the absence of any training, in the absence of any professional experience whatsoever, Olmsted simply declared himself an architect, and then upon winning the design competition was so emboldened that he promoted himself to architect-in-chief. It was only in 1859, after several years of work, including these design studies of what would be the development of Central Park, it was only in 1859, upon a visit to European precedents. Olmsted had been sent on this European tour ostensibly to study European precedents for his large park, but really the commissioners were trying to gain control over a budget that Olmsted was rapidly outspending. He was also a little bit at the end of his rope emotionally. He tended to work himself into a fever. And so the superintendent said, go and spend 6 months in Europe in 1859, summer and fall, and study the precedents, beginning in the British Isles, working through the continent. On this tour, in October, November of 59, Olmsted spent 2 weeks in Paris, and he visited the Bois de Boulogne, the French hunting ground, being converted by Alphonse as a part of the Haussmannisation of Paris. He visited no less than 8 times. And on that visit, he would have seen drawings stamped Service de l'architecte paysagiste, which is the French formulation, a hyphenated formulation that had its origin in the early 19th century. In the French formulation, this was somebody that was doubly trained as an engineer and an architect and a landscapist, which is really a drawer or painter of landscapes. Olmsted seized upon that identity in part because of its Francophone origins, but equally because he saw at the Bois de Boulogne the full scope of this new professional realm, from urban infrastructure and urban development on the one hand, through the management of public space and infrastructure on the other hand, all the way through the uniform of the police, the constabulary specific to the parks, a complete Gesamtkunstwerk in the German sense of a complete work of art. In this context, of course, what had been conceived in Manhattan was really the Commissioner's Grid of 1807, 1811. By the time Olmsted is working, the lower tip of Manhattan is urbanized, but all of this gridiron is really a kind of real estate projection. It's a kind of fantasy. Upon returning in November of 1859 and into the spring of 1860, the first commission that Olmsted applies this new title to is not for the planning of a park. It's not for the design of a promenade or a pleasure ground or a private garden. It's for the design of the shape of the city north of 155th Street. So the first commission in early 1860, and we have clear correspondence on this, is for the planning of the shape of the city, in which the landscape architect was hired initially to conceive not only of the block structure and parcelization, but equal to the urban infrastructure, the built form, the building blocks setback, building heights, and the like, the true métier of an urbanist today, what we would think of as an urban designer or an urban planner. Ultimately, the Olmsted and Vaux scheme was executed but not completely built out, and by the 1880s an adapted version had been built out, the so-called Knapp plan you see here. But after the success of that project in 1860, Olmsted and Vaux retroactively apply the term landscape architect, first to Central Park, and then ultimately to Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and to the Emerald Necklace here in Boston, ultimately to the range of canonical early works. So in this story, what I find notable is in its original conception, the idea of the new professional was meant to be responsible not simply for the ecological or the gardening arts, but equally for the social and the urban conditions from the point of view of real estate development, built form, infrastructure, and the like. And that's a very audacious, robust claim, but it's clearly the idea that Olmsted and his colleagues, his boosters, his friends had in mind. In fact, by the close of the 19th century, we have the formation of the American Society of Landscape Architects, a new professional identity. We also have a new academic program at Harvard, a graduate degree in this field. We have a new journal, we have a body of literature, and we have a nascent profession. Of course, what happened was that the urban commitments of our field became so pronounced that by the 1920s and 30s, we spun off an entirely new field called planning. And that by the 1930s, planning was up and running as its own professional identity, its own journal, its own degree program. And that left landscape architecture bereft. It left us with the decorative, the trivial, the plant material, the ornamental, the aesthetic. And our urban material was lost, which is why when I encountered landscape architecture for the first time, I was led to believe that it was primarily to do with plants. Over the course of the last 15 years, myself, but also a range of others, have been arguing that really landscape has been re-emerging as a medium of urbanization. And I put this in this historical context because I believe between the 1930s and the 1990s, there was a period of time, 50 or 60 years, in which you would more than likely hire an urban designer or an urban planner to address questions of urban form. For a whole variety of reasons that I'll touch on briefly, over the last 10 or 15 years, the landscape architect has reasserted himself as the urbanist of our age. In this regard, Stan Allen's quote, Stan, the former dean of architecture at Princeton, argued at the turn of the millennium that increasingly landscape is emerging as a model for urbanism. This occurred at a curious intersection and in response to a void with respect to the work of the other design professionals. By that I mean architect, urban designer, urban planner. It begins in the 1980s and 1990s with a group of architects and urbanists interested in questions of program and event, in which they were less interested in the stylistic baggage of particular style wars around postmodernism. And so beginning with the work of a group of people educated at the AA in London, this is one of those, Rem Koolhaas, his firm's called OMA, their project for the Parc de la Villette competition in Paris. You see the idea of using landscape as a medium to orchestrate urban event, to choreograph program, and to do away with the necessity for all of that building baggage, let's say. A decade later, that work has enormous influence on a group of landscape architects working in Europe and in the North American context. In this case, one example would be the work of Adrien Heus, again, West 8, who's joining us in March for his lecture, with projects such as this, the Shell project, which is for the storm barrier on the North Sea and the Netherlands Dutch coast. We see projects from the 1990s in which ecological principles, in this case, a found material, mussel shells, are being organized into alternating, contrasting black and white stripes. Now, Adrien, having studied ecology, at the Dutch Federal School at Wageningen understood ecology as a kind of applied natural science. What's happening in this period of time in the 1990s is that landscape architects and architects begin to use ecology both as an applied natural science, but equally as a mechanism or a format or an operating system for design culture. And so in this regard, projects like this have little ambition to put back existing ecologies. They're simply using the fact that birds with lighter feathers will land on lighter shells, and birds with darker feathers will land on darker stripes. And so it's a kind of operating system, it's a kind of theater or a kind of spectacle. There are certain environmental advantages. It's a recycled material, it's native, of course, it has other habitat advantages. So it is performing ecologically, but in this regard, the landscape urbanist emerges, and Heuze is a good example of this by the 1990s, as somebody who's capable of understanding advanced, elite, international design culture at the highest level, but also operating environmentally or ecologically. By the turn of the millennium, 2000, we have a series of design competitions that are by now canonical. This is an air base in Toronto, Canada, called Downsview, in which this project, James Corner and Stan Allen collaborate to conceive of an urban district in which, rather than beginning with streets, rather than beginning with the shape of the city, they argue that we should begin with the charismatic megafauna, identify the key species that should be prioritized. The moose is always very popular in Canada, the coyote, and then to engineer, or in their terms, curate environments around those species. So this is, again, using principles of landscape ecology, and to grow a more robust park or a more robust public realm over time than we have the ability to build all at once in the present economy. And at the same time, using principles of landscape ecology and succession process to try to build or grow a more robust ecological function than might immediately be available. Of course, it was Rem Koolhaas himself, OMA, that won that design competition. More about that later. So this emergence in the last 15 or 20 years is built upon, on the one hand, the historic identity of the landscape architect, this new professional responsible for the social and environmental conditions of the city, but based also upon 20th century understandings of landscape ecology. And in this regard, James Corner, of course, studied at the University of Pennsylvania with Ian McHarg. McHarg, the planner, landscape architect, who really changed the field internationally in the middle of the 20th century, publishing in the late 60s Design with Nature, in which he argued for a kind of landscape planning in which the landscape architect was repositioned to embrace and adopt ecological information as a form of mapping through which the shape of the city might be regulated, right? And so at its most robust form, whether it was McHarg's definition of landscape planning at Penn, or our colleagues at the GSD inventing geographic information systems in the 1960s and 70s, by the middle of the 20th century, we have landscape planning reasserting itself as a framework in which the scientific knowledge of ecological conditions could be applied to the shape of the city. So by the late 60s, when Ian and his colleagues are making these plans of Staten Island, he's doing an overlay method in which ecological knowledge, hydrological knowledge, the best scientific knowledge is being applied to where we should build and where we shouldn't. And if you look at those maps and what happened following Hurricane Sandy, this is not rocket science. You know, water flows downhill. Gravity and elevation do matter in the end. These things are empirically known. And in this context, of course, we were challenged by a relative political economy in which we decided not to design the city around this knowledge. So by the course of the 70s and 80s, we had increasing scientific knowledge, we have better mapping, we have better data, and yet we live in a political economy in North America, for better and worse, in which we've chosen not to shape the cities in this way. The city, as a result, is much more the resultant of economic or power relationships in which individual actors play out a range of different schemes. So staying on Staten Island for a moment, this is mid-90s to the 2000s, the work of James Corner Field Operations again for Freshkill Landfill. So this had been, until 2000 when it was closed, the largest landfill on the planet, a place of incredible toxicity, but also a place that, by virtue of a unique political alignment, the unique condition of a Republican governor in New York State, a Republican mayor in New York City, enabling patronage onto Staten Island, and Freshkill's landfill needing a great deal of attention environmentally, James Corner Field Operation produced this plan, which is now under construction, in which they, lacking the funding to build a robust public park in the manner of Central Park or Prospect Park, what they do is they remediate, they clean, using techniques of phytoremediation, soil construction, and other things, specific to landscape urbanism, in which they can grow a more robust or healthful public realm over time. And so the fundamental claims here are that landscape is a medium that's capable of cleaning the air and the soil and the water, producing biodiversity and habitat and rich species diversity, in which over time one can grow a more robust and healthful urban realm than we might be able to build all at once. In this body of work, of course, we now increasingly have a body of built work around the world, and you can find examples of this kind of landscape urbanist discourse and practices around the world, whether it's East Asia, Latin America, or across Europe. Of course, the High Line in New York would be at the other scalar end of the range, right? A kind of boutique destination neighborhood in which the landscape architect, in this case, again, James Corner Field Operations with Diller, Scafidio, Renfro, the architects, and Piet Oudolph, the Dutch plantsman, conceive of what was originally thought to be an impediment to design, this former rail trestle that was initially planned for demolition in the Giuliani administration. It was not through the planning department, of course, that the High Line was saved. It was through a community meeting, right? When the community said, through a group of leaders, said, well, isn't there a better way? Can't we save this piece of industrial archaeology, and can't we use that? And through the formation of the Friends of the High Line and these incredible Joel Sternfeld photographs, made it a cultural icon. They also fundraised for it at a level as if it were a cultural institution. And that combination of a community activist position to save a piece of industrial archaeology, combined with design culture and patron activity, that combines to produce a range of activities we can see now in cities across North America. Certainly in the last several years, New York has been among the most compelling examples. You see here the Hudson River piers being rebuilt, wholly rebuilt in this transition from an industrial economy, former sites of industry and port activity being transitioned into public realm, parks and the like. Of course, as everyone's apparently moving to Brooklyn, at least their kids are, Brooklyn Bridge Park by Michael Van Valkenburg Associates is another excellent example of this general tendency, in which the landscape architect's capacity, I would argue unique capacity for ecological or environmental or hydrological literacy on the one hand, but capacity for leveraging design culture, donor arts, philanthropic interest and the like, combines to address what's really a void within the design professions, in which, as architects over the last several decades have chosen to explore their own autonomy, their own cultural form in the absence of the city, as urban planning retreated from questions of physical form and is more and more focused on being a social or political science, and as urban design really bet on a kind of traditional European town plan. In this context, I think that Toronto is probably the most compelling example in the world of this set of tendencies. This is Toronto. This is Canada's largest city, our neighbors to the north, home to 5 million people. Its waterfront is a former industrial site, having been made redundant in the 1950s and 60s by virtue of the invention of the shipping container. Once Malcolm Purcell invented the shipping container in the 1950s, it essentially made Great Lakes shipping no longer viable. Over the course of the last decade, Waterfront Toronto has been reorganizing these lands and organizing new districts of the city, in which their goal is to build dense, walkable, low-carbon, highly sustainable urban districts in which they're hiring landscape architects. They have half a dozen of the world's leading landscape architects operating as their urbanists. And I thought I would show you just briefly a couple of projects from the last couple of years there. The first was a project for the central waterfront, sort of centerpiece of downtown Toronto on the waterfront. This was a design competition that was invited, and then a second round they prioritized 5 finalist teams. 4 of those teams were led by architects, by very good architects, and those teams were then competing with one team led by a landscape architect, in this case again Adrian Heuss, Westgate, who will be with us in March. Adrian and Westgate won the project, I'm told by the jurors that were in the room and voted for it, because they were the only one that said, before we have destination buildings, our project must function ecologically. And by ecologically, they meant 2 things you can see in this diagram. First of all, this heavy gauge trolley system, which is extant in Toronto, is as close to a zero carbon transit system as we had when it's fed by hydroelectric power. while all the other schemes moved the trolley alignment to make way for more destination architecture, Adrian and his team said, no, this is fundamental. That and recuperating the lacustrine, the lake ecology, the fish habitat, the stormwater management, right? So in this section, in lieu of sexy architecture, which the other teams led with, they said, no, let's get the carbon right. Let's get the lake habitat right. And then on that ecological foundation, let's understand both species habitat, but also human habitat, and engineer a robust and healthful public realm on top of that. This work is under construction now in Toronto. It's among the most, I think, compelling built environments in North America just now. And it's the centerpiece of a whole series of urban districts which are coming online over the course of the next several years. I thought I would just show you one of those districts by way of comparison. Just to the east of the central waterfront, so this is the inner harbor, central waterfront is here. You can see the watershed of the Don River. This is a piece of both flood control management, estuary reconstruction, so landscape conservation, landscape reconstruction, but equally a district that would house 25,000 new residents in dense, walkable, transit-based urbanism. You can see here in these diagrams, again, Michael van Valkenburg Associates with Ken Greenberg, the winning scheme, taking what was a very tough, canalized industrial brownfield, opening that up, trebling the amount of surface area given to the water, reconstructing an entirely new functioning river estuary system on a site that it hadn't existed on before, and then providing flood protection, regulatory spillways, and the like. That's the foundation for what is ultimately a series of new urban districts, new urban neighborhoods, in which Banish and Banish are the architects, Trans-Solar are the German energy modelers. We have fashion-forward architecture. We have the most advanced modeling for carbon, greenhouse gases, and the like. And you see an image like this, which is now underway in Toronto, in which a wholly new ecosystem is being engineered here as the foundation for new urban districts or new modes of living. This kind of work is what we mean by landscape urbanism. We see examples like this all around the world just now. And as I mentioned, Toronto is really at the forefront of that, along with New York and a couple of other cities in North America. You can see here this image, which is from the same design competition made by local landscape architect Chris Reed of Stoss Landscape Urbanism. Chris was with us a couple of weeks ago. And you can see here his entry to the same design competition, which he and his team described as beginning again with the keystone species. So rather than beginning with ideas about architectural form, rather than beginning with ideas about block structure or transit, Chris Reed says that we should begin by building a sex park for fish. Start with the species that we want, engineer an environment or environments in which those species will thrive, and engineer a whole series of hybrid parts to allow the reconstruction of natural ecologies. A part of what Chris and what other landscape urbanists are trading upon is that the fish don't have a cultural position on this. The fish don't need it to look old. They don't need it to be brick or gaslight. They need it actually to function for them environmentally. And in that regard, Chris and his team imagine new forms of lifestyle, new forms of environment, new forms of urbanization built upon the foundation or the basis of this new lacustrine or estuarian ecological condition. It's that kind of work that we mean by landscape urbanism, and it's that kind of work that we invoke when we argue that the landscape architect is operating as the urbanist of our age. Thanks very much for coming out. So I'd be more than happy to chat with you if any of you have questions. I know there are many other pressing engagements, a couple of events at the MFA and some other things going on this evening, so please don't be bashful if you need to get back to your car, but if you do have questions, I'd be happy to take them, yes?
How would you label capability ground in terms of...
Excellent question. So the question is, what about capability ground? Where does he fit into this schema? And I think that capability Brown is indicative of, as would be Repton, of a great Anglo tradition of landscape gardening. That distinction we could talk about. On the one hand, what I mean to suggest is this is somebody who made a living in a way that has aspects that seem professional, right? So he had a business card, he traveled from site to site. I would distinguish it from landscape architecture in a couple of ways. First of all, he also made his living by making improvements. And so one distinction there is this a trade or is this a professional activity? The founders of the American Society of Landscape Architects invited either landscape gardeners or landscape architects to apply, but they said that they would not admit people who made their primary business through the trades. And this is a long-standing anxiety, you could say, about professional identity and needing to distance oneself from the selling of plants or the moving of earth. Another thing to say about Capability Brown is if you look at the kinds of clientele that he's dealing with, mostly serving the gentry, mostly serving private estates, doing consequential, ultimately canonical work in a genre of ambitious, robust, but ultimately landscape gardening, I would say. That's really the question that led me to wonder, why didn't Olmstead favor that term? Because clearly it's the dominant tradition that I've been given. It's clearly the dominant tradition that Olmstead would have had available. Downing and Vaux came out of that tradition. In fact, most of the first members of the American Society chose that term. And what I found was that Olmstead really preferred the Francophone origin, not just for cultural terms, but primarily because the French conception included the public realm, urban infrastructure, and built form. It was a much more ambitious project. Ultimately, in his diaries, Olmstead complained later in life of the, quote, miserable nomenclature of landscape. He said, landscape is terrible, architecture is worse, gardening is even worse than both of those. So he missed the French subtleties. Of course, he would have been fluent in those, in the French formulations for the more precise art. But in the French formulation, not only was there a kind of cultural snobbery, there was a more ambitious program for a professional in the public realm, I would say. We've got one back here on the aisle, Jess.
Can you talk about how some of these ideas are playing out in Boston?
Sure, yeah. One way that these ideas are playing out in Boston is that when I moved to town, I met some of the civic leaders and people in the arts, and I met Anne Holly, and I sat on her sofa, and she asked me, I was advising her on, well, what should the museum do relative to landscape? And I sketched out something that looked like this series of lectures and something like our fellowship and something like exhibitions. And she said, okay, we're going to do that. So at the level of ideas, I would say that. That's a very happy tale. On the other hand, I was in a similar room, in kind of a conference room table, not a couch, not in an Italian Venetian palazzo, but in a kind of new building on the waterfront that looked like it could have been in Houston, where I was advising people associated with the Olympic bid. And when they announced their bid, I agreed to advise them on public programming, because it was a little concerning to some of my colleagues and I that they didn't seem to really be engaging the public at all. And we said, you might want to test drive some of this and get it in front of audiences, and that was kind of a new idea for them. My wife Sienna's with us tonight. Sienna's done all the graphic design for our series here. Sienna said when they had the announcement of the public bid for the Olympics, that the opposition group had a better logo. She didn't think it was going to end well. And so on the other hand, I see great civic leadership in Boston. Its institutions have been reborn. They've been the buildings are being added to, and Anne Holly is indicative of that. And so at the cultural level, at the level of ideas, I see great optimism. When I see the way that the Olympics were handled, it's indicative of a different cultural tradition, I would say. And in that regard, of course, the Greenway is, of course, a work in progress. As an outsider coming to town, I think that they've hired some very good people to deal with it. But it was clearly a project that came late in a process that was primarily driven by transportation. And for all the right reasons, maybe it was with good intentions, it really was something added to a project that was about something else. And so what I see in New York, what I see in Toronto, what I see in China are projects that are integrating landscape earlier in the process. And so in that regard, I'm optimistic. I see many, many opportunities and examples of things. But I would say, I would turn the question back to you and ask you, what do you see in Boston?
Well, I don't see very much, which is why I wanted to get your, maybe there's something that
if you look at the institutions that are, commissioning landscape architects, if you look at the, first of all, obviously the incredible, robust array of educational institutions, the hospitals, the labs, they are incredible patrons of landscape architecture. They have some of the world's best landscape architects doing work. And while the campus work is different than this kind of city building, that's one place to look. I would say that almost every campus that's growing is doing consequential landscape work that doesn't get the same level of visibility. Secondly, individual pieces here and there along the Greenway and elsewhere are quite remarkable. And then, of course, we would have to invoke the great heritage of the canonical pieces, right? The esplanade, right? The emerald necklace itself. These are extraordinary cultural treasures, and at the same moment, they seem often disconnected from a culture of development, or there's a kind of anxiety historically between those two. And so what you see, for example, at the High Line in New York was, in some ways, a curious affiliation where planning really took a back seat and private development and private arts philanthropy came together around some cultural patronage to produce something that in the end is like a park, but is really functioning at the business model level a bit like a museum. I think we had one over here on the right.
Right here, of course.
The mic is just...
Right here, of course, there's something going on, which is the restoration of the Muddy River. I don't know much about it, but it's right at your doorstep, and it's one of the great classics. How does this fit into that?
Sure, yeah. I think the Muddy River work, while ongoing, is obviously important. It had become really dysfunctional in a variety of ways. For me, it's a matter of going back to talk about the audacity of the claim of the Fens itself, right? The idea that you could build a new urban district, right? This was all greenfield, right? And in which land development, but also cultural institutions combined with stormwater management, combined with a whole series of species and habitat, that integrated image of public landscape that was not only aesthetic, but was performative, right? That it could actually do things in terms of ecosystem services or in terms of infrastructure. That, for me, was really the audacity of the claim. And of course, over time, it required a level of maintenance, and it's had a series of impacts. And so I think there's important work being done. But it's very much in the spirit of plumbing, right? It's kind of reconstructing, rebuilding, etc. And at the same time, we see both the MFA and the Gardner Museum having recommitted, reestablishing their physical plants recently. I think that there's a new moment around the Fens. And we were just at an event at the MFA a couple of minutes before this, and they have an extraordinary relationship there as well. And there's been talk here in the museum about maybe doing an exhibition around that set of ideas that would look at this in historical context, not just at Olmstead, but the idea of city building. And there's also been a discussion that we might be interested in to look at the existing bridge alignment just here, which is historic, but was eventually taken out at some point over anxiety really around a different period of time in the city's history. So, yeah.
Could you talk about the conceptual threads you have moving through these landscape series of lectures?
So the question was, what's the conceptual thread? What's the continuity? When I was sitting on Helen's couch, I said, there are very few institutions of any kind that do landscape programming. For many, many years, the museum had been committed to its courtyard and its gardens, and we continue to be robustly engaged in the horticultural and garden arts. Maybe 15 years ago, Laurie Olin, who's a landscape architect based in Philadelphia, was an advisor and was on a kind of peer review advisory mission to the museum and had known Anne for some time and recommended to Anne that they, in addition to horticulture, build programming in landscape. And that then led to the conversation of a landscape curator. I'm the second person to hold this position. And so as I was talking to Anne Hawley, what I saw was really a void in which, while there are schools, there are professional associations, there are no, and there are botanical societies and garden programs. I don't know of any cultural institution, I don't know of any museum in North America that maintains a landscape curator or has a landscape series like this. And so we started there, and I said, full stop, our mandate is to bring the world's finest landscape architects who have a foothold in practice in North America to speak here. And so we started there. And so just kind of brute cultural capital, and with a deference to seniority as well, like people that, and with a priority toward built work. And that gave us a list, on the one hand, that you could say is sort of the usual suspects within our field. None of these names would be surprising. But by the time we get to 20, even while waiting until June for Julie Bargman, what we see is really a breadth of practices in which landscape architects are working around the world. But cumulatively, compared to any other institution in North America, this stage has seen the leadership of the field in a way that I don't know that any other institution could claim that. within that, we encourage the speakers to try to speak in autobiographical and personal ways to broad audiences, to make it personal, and most of them have been, I think, quite successful at this, and to talk in a way about their personal passion. And I often try to draw out in the question from them how they found the field, how did they become interested in this? And most often that's been productive in terms of making it something personal. I can tell you that the speakers that come, in addition to having Joanne Robinson's lovely hospitality and the hospitality of the museum, they feel very warmly welcomed. They also have a sense that to have a museum commit to the field is also significant. And I think that's also part of why they invest in the series as well. And so going forward, what we've said is we're going to continue to work through the finest practicing landscape architects who have a foothold or a base in practice in North America. And right now we have another 5 years schemed out before we run out of ideas. And hopefully between now and then, if you'll still bear with us and come out, between now and then we'll have another group of emerging talent as well. Over here.
I'm from Cambridge, and I've been walking in a formerly derelict park along the Charles River for years. And back when it was derelict, I would walk through, and hundreds of birds would fly up. Just swallows and swallows and swallows, more than you could identify, more than you could count. It was like an amazing place to go, and it was derelict, so no one else would be down there. And, the hawks would come down if you went down early Sunday morning, no rush hour before the dog walkers came out. You could sit there and a whole bunch of goshawks would come down and they would catch a meal. And you could sit there in the middle of this in Cambridge and watch a whole bunch of cocks hunting the squirrels, and you could watch these amazing sequences where the squirrel runs away and the hawk goes after, and the squirrel runs here and the hawk goes there, and the squirrel goes up the tree and the hawk comes down and the squirrel runs around the tree, and the hawk is looking like this, and it's like this amazing thing, and you're sitting in Cambridge. And then we're developing it into a park that functions, and guess what? The swallows aren't there, the hawks aren't there, and I suspect the hawks left for other reasons, actually. But I'm struggling to think about, and now I'm making an inventory of the birds down there, and I've identified 94 species so far. Not necessarily large numbers, but lots of species. But the question becomes, as humans move in, because of the way we're thinking, we have ideas of what a park is. Park is where you do this, you play soccer, you play baseball, you have all these human activities, and what's going on around in nature is just not built into our way of thinking, and I'm very struck that we need to turn it on its head and really think who are here now? What's going on in the river? What's the relationship between the river and the birds? How come there are 150 goldfinches in this little area, right now, chowing down on the goldenrod? How can we sort of keep that happening? While we also have these other sort of plans to do stuff in it.
It's a vivid image. It's like National Geographical. I mean, you've made Cambridge so much more exotic. I'm a Cantabrigian myself, recently adopted. We have a little domestic conversation about squirrels. I'm a pro squirrel guy. I mean, around the edges. I don't begrudge a hawk a meal here and there, but Sienna is deeply, deeply terrified of the squirrels. So it's a nice picture that you paint, and I do think you're right exactly in finding a correlation between rich, robust, diverse habitat and urban abandonment. It's precisely about where we are not as the dominant predator. Another thing that I think you quite rightly highlight right now is a great anxiety in our field, which is around the extent to which things need to be usefully programmed. And so along with philanthropy and park culture, often not just the soccer pitches and the desire for recreation, active and otherwise, but equally the demands of commerce and the cafe and all the other mechanisms that enable park life. I think there's a long-standing dialectic between over-programming of public parks and the desire to make places that kids can go get lost in, right? I think that's, and at the same moment, we know that in places that humans recede from, whether it's Rome or Detroit or your abandoned parking lot, nature comes back, right? It does fine. It changes, of course, over time, and it will do. But at the same moment, I'm struck, compared to my professional experience elsewhere, that there's such a robust set of communities and literacy around both the agency for habitat, but equally for the stewardship of the public realm. I don't mean to suggest that it's all sorted out, but I think one of the issues that I've found is that certainly in Cambridge, things are essentially downzoned to almost nothing. I know that there's a little bit of new growth here and there, but the desire to keep things as they are, whether it's Cambridge or elsewhere, produces a condition where it may not be as possible to build density where we need to, and as a result, it means that we may not be able to produce the kind of void elsewhere to enable habitat and that kind of thing.
Well, I'm looking around the city and I'm going, you know, I'm trying to just start thinking about this, but I'm looking at the opportunities and I'm going, okay, we need soccer fields. They're great. And they use a lot of land for a limited amount of hours. So when we build a parking garage, why don't we put a soccer field on it instead of driving away, you know, the birds? Or we, you know, it looks to me like we're still in the British Manor look, where we have these linear trees and lots of grass, but not a lot can live there. And I'm just trying to think about, in fact, if we looked at all the grass in Cambridge, all the grass in Harvard that does nothing but sit there, all the grass at MIT that does nothing but sit there, and we thought about what might be done to actually rebuild some ecosystems, there would be enormous possibility to make something incredibly interesting and vibrant while we really hopefully address the issue of, you know, species disappearance.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And at the same moment, I would say a couple of things. One is, you know, my understanding is that vis-a-vis water quality, there have been some successes in the not too distant past. At the same moment, we have the big driver of climate change, sea levels coming. There's some number of inches of freeboard left on the basin dam, right? So there are drivers there, but also there's an increasing sense, and I think landscape architects are central to this, that landscapes can be performative, they can be productive, right? They can be productive in terms of habitat or species protection or forage. They can also be productive in terms of urban agriculture and a range of things. And there are cultural politics there. I don't know if the business school will abandon its Neo-Georgian landscape anytime soon in favor of flaxseed. But at the same moment, these ideas are available, let's say, for institutions and individuals that want to pursue them. I think we have time for 2 more questions. There was one back here in the back.
Thank you. Many urban areas are suffering from some form of, some level of blight, particularly in neighborhoods populated by people who are under severe stress because of social, economic pressures. I'm wondering, what do landscape architects today see as their role in helping these blighted urban areas? Or are they really focusing on helping, you know, museums and colleges and that sort of thing with their landscape?
Sure, yeah. Following I think it's a fundamental question. You know, one of the biggest changes in my career has been we now have a group of students, a generation of students coming into the design professions who see no contradiction at all between working as a design professional, an architect, a landscape architect, a planner, and being socially or environmentally engaged. And I would contrast that with 25 years prior, most design professionals, and I consider myself in that same category, were forced to make a kind of false choice. Either culture associated with development, the identity of the architect on the one hand, or social engagement or environmental advocacy were the 3 most obvious choices. But they were constructed most often, at least in my experience, to be mutually exclusive of one another. And I think that's changing, broadly speaking. In the 3 historic periods of the professional identity that I've sketched out, so end of the 19th century, middle of the 20th century, and in the recent past, I think that there's a slightly different answer that's available. I believe that Olmstead had a deeply felt, sincere commitment to, in the bounds of his historical era, he obviously was bounded by that historical circumstance, to what we would describe today as a sense of social equity. Now, the form that it took was that if we could give access of the unwashed masses access to mingling with the middle and the upper class. There was a kind of, you know, social hygiene through education, but equally access to places that emulated the qualities of nature. That those 2 things, the mixing of classes, the edification of the lower classes in the public park, combined with the qualities associated with nature and a kind of transcendentalist American tradition, that the Central Park or the Prospect Park would have a socially leavening effect. And that plus the building of new districts, whether it's here in Boston or in New York, would enable housing and improve not only the social conditions, but equally the environmental and housing conditions for the working underclass. Now, of course, that's bounded in the historical era that it was placed, and we wouldn't put it that way today. In the middle of the 20th century, of course, we had conceptions such as blight, slum, the idea of social pathology being akin to a natural illness. And we had practices of redlining. These were, of course, in the United States experience, the best product of the New Deal. They were the best progressive ideas we had, right? Slum clearance, demolition, right? And the idea of erasure. Those ideas happily have been transcended. And in most contexts, what we see right now is a neoliberal political economy in which designers are eager to produce more healthful, more socially just, more engaged and collective public form, but in which cities, generally speaking in North America, have decided really not to use all the elements at their disposal vis-a-vis planning. And at the same moment, as we've retreated away from ideas about public housing in North America, generally speaking, we've favored subsidies and political and economic mechanisms in lieu of spatial solutions. It means that designers have faced a kind of, I think, difficult choice. On the one hand, they could wait for the social and political changes that would necessitate the building of new political economies in which the designer could directly build public housing, or they could engage to improve the world as it is through the political economy that we have. And so in that regard, landscape urbanism more recently is built upon the political economy as it's found, in which there's nothing that a designer can do by the shape of the city to either predict or enforce a future social contract. Having said that, I see designers, landscape architects among them, in each of these three areas, doing their utmost to enable or support that social contract where it's available more broadly. And that's a relatively weak position the designer occupies, but having said that, you'll find landscape architects working across that spectrum. Of course, there are some who devote their practice to private clients, to private gardens and private estates, and quite rightly. But overwhelmingly in our series, we're showing you the work of landscape architects that are engaged in building a public realm that's meant to be inclusive, but that public realm is most often delivered through the political economy of our day, in which the development of housing has overwhelmingly become a private capital development. And there are exceptions to that, and there are some arguments to be had around that, and if there are other options to it as well. But we also find a range of landscape architects engaged in the developing world, in the global south, and various parts of the world, but equally here in the United States, in Detroit, in St. Louis, and other communities, trying to use productive landscapes. Walter Hood came from Oakland, California, to present his work, which is really community-engaged planning, building with very low budget, very low capacity, community around the work of landscape architecture. Last one back here.
A scheme like Toronto, obviously you're dealing with something of a sort of blank canvas, but what about, in fact, what you've almost just touched on there, at the other end of the scale, where perhaps you've got overly dense urban building, which is a historical fact, often like Staten Island in a poor situation. What are your thoughts about actually trying to inject landscape back into that? As I say, the car park that gets demolished, you know, and you're trying to make something for the community there. What are your comments on that?
Yeah. I'm generally optimistic in that, compared to when I started my career, most places that I go, not just the designers, not just the architects and landscape architects, but the civic leadership and the political leadership, increasingly, directors of planning, mayors, not just in North America, but around the world. I was in China last week, 2 weeks before that in Europe, and in these places, increasingly, not just the design leadership, but the political leadership sees the necessity of recuperating environmental performance. And in certain places, it takes different forms. In some places, it's really primarily an aesthetic issue. In other cases, it's performative around food. In some cases, it's about stormwater management. Sometimes it's about sea level or climate change. It takes different forms in different parts of the world. But I'm generally optimistic that that trend line that produced landscape urbanism, the need for environmental performance in our urban districts, will be with us for some time. Having said that, in North America especially, we have a big, I think, a profound contradiction. On the one hand, we will increasingly see storm events. We saw Katrina in New Orleans. We see Sandy on the eastern seaboard. My research group at Harvard is working just now in Miami Beach, which is among the most vulnerable to sea level rise. They have water in the streets right now almost every day. As these things are ongoing, it's almost impossible for any political leader at any level in the United States to prevent a resident to return to their community. So what I say is there's a de facto kind of right of return around environmental conditions in the United States. We saw it after Katrina in New Orleans, where of course, the rational planning thing to do was to not resettle the lower ninth. This is just empirical physics. It's not that complicated. And whereas Ian McHarg's maps of Staten Island were prescient, having that knowledge doesn't necessarily allow us at the political or the societal level to make those choices. Another example closer to home, we were one of the group of faculty that organized a course on sea level and municipal response at Harvard with faculty and students from law, engineering, planning, landscape architecture. I thought it was going to be about physics. I thought it was, okay, I get this, it's engineering, there's water levels, there's topography. In week 3, I learned it's about reinsurance markets. In week 4, I learned that, people that are lucky enough to have a house on Cape Cod have mortgage insurance rates that are underwritten at the Commonwealth level because, in fact, the state requires insurance underwriters to insure houses in exactly producing a kind of moral hazard. So I think we have, on the one hand, increasing capacity within the design professions to deal with these issues. We have increasing relationships between scientists and designers. At the same moment, we have a political economy in which it's very difficult for any politician to prevent somebody to going back and building their house. And I would say that, of course, for all the right reasons, and in fact, it's in some ways an overcorrection, I would say, to our experiences in the middle of the 20th century, right? In the kind of the caricature of Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses and St. Jane 1, of course, and we're still overcorrecting toward community in that regard. And it's very difficult in that context for any political leadership to intervene in such a way as, unless, and there are certain caveats around public takings that we could talk about, but by and large, we're still in an era of communitarianism in which a relatively small number of individuals can stand for a community. And in that context, it becomes very difficult to reconnect or reestablish in whole cloth, let's say, systems or territories. Having said that, my friend Richard Foreman, landscape ecologist, tells me that at about 1 house per acre, natural systems will reconnect anyway, right? And so I'm optimistic that even in those moments of discontinuity, in moments where people will persist with their historic community, of course, there's possible work to be done. And then the last thing I'll say is, of course, we are now in the era of climate change refugees, right? I mean, the federal government has recently authorized funds, even through the Republican House, to spend money, millions and millions of US dollars, to relocate a population of Native Americans living on the Isle of John Charles in the lower Mississippi in Louisiana. And that's just the beginning of what I think will be a generational condition where people are not only forced to leave by virtue of a storm event, but I think many of them will be forced ultimately to abandon their homestead altogether, their community altogether, in favor of places that are upland and drier, among other things. So thanks all for coming out, and I look forward to seeing you again. Look forward to correspondence from us about the rescheduling of Julie Bargman in June, and join us March 9th, Adrian Hoos. Thanks.